We have the delightful Nicola Spurling, who is a senior lecturer in the Department of Sociology in Lancaster, and will resume her role as CeMoRe's director in the autumn. So you'll be stepping down, Lynn, I said at this point, which is really good. Nicola's research focuses on the social cultural change that is needed to tackle climate change and the socio-cultural changes that are emerging in relation to changing climates. She has a particular interest in autobiography, mobilities, practice theory, and as a means of shedding new light on complex and often unspoken aspects of everyday life. An anthropologist by training, she has authored numerous and important articles relating to sustainability, societal readiness, and mobility's futures. So I'd really like to welcome Nicola to the stage. Thank you.
Hi everybody, it's really nice to see everyone here. So once again, doing something slightly different again, as James intimated. Although I think I am saying some things that resonate with some of the things that James said. So in my contribution to this conversation, I just wanted to put forward a couple of modest reflections on mobility scholarship in relation to this specific period that I've been CeMoRe director. Or perhaps a better way of putting it is to say that I want to reflect on this particular period of global and social history during which I've been CeMoRe director and consider the implications that it potentially has for mobilities research. And these are reflections that end with questions. I'm not providing any answers here today. So I found out that I would be the next CeMoRe director in January 2020, with a view that I would take up the position in the October of that year. And as you might recall now, that was quite an eventful year. In January, the word COVID didn't really mean much to anyone at all. And by the October, we were entering a tiered system of lockdowns across the UK, having already experienced a year of unprecedented disruption globally, disruptions that were connected to and underpinned by mobilities in every way and at every scale. The time that I became director of CeMoRe also coincided with what already felt like a significant cultural moment. So in those years, 2018, 2019, 2020, the climate and ecological emergency had risen to the top of public agendas in the UK and in many countries around the world. The actualities of climate change were starting to register in much more tangible ways. Locally, I'd really noticed amongst my own students, so I teach in the area of environment, culture and society, and I run an undergraduate module for sociology students on climate change and sociology. And in that year, 2019, 2020, there was something really different with that student cohort. There was definitely a level of anxiety amongst the students that I hadn't experienced before. There was a new level of awareness. So whereas for many years there'd been a need on that module to spend time explaining what climate change is, that it exists, that it's societally and systemically produced, in many ways, I suddenly sort of noticed this change where that material was somewhat redundant. Students were entering the classroom from a different place. And I think that reflected the fact that they had come of age in a different educational and social context than previous cohorts. They were grappling with the future in a different way too. They were grappling with a future that they knew would be shaped by climate and environmental issues. And in those sort of the year and then the months preceding the pandemic, the UN published its 2019 assessment of life on Earth. It released the warning that 1 million species were at risk of extinction. Across the UK and to an extent around the globe, organisations and institutions were declaring a state of climate emergency or receiving public pressure to do so. Greta Thunberg and the School Strikes for Climate meant that children and the young people's movement had developed, and it was creating a wave of mobilisation in relation to climate change in the build up to COP26, which should have been that year but was postponed. And the activities of other activist groups as well, not least Extinction Rebellion, were also gaining momentum and public profile. And so this context really framed the fact that we focused, when I sort of became director, we focused CeMoRe on a 5-year programme on climate change. And I wrote a manifesto collaboratively with many people here and with some that aren't in the latter part of 2020 that set the stage for that. And through writing this manifesto and sort of organising our programme in relation to it, and then taking account of COVID and the ongoing sense-making of that period and its implications, I think it raises a question for how climate change and more broadly the current moment, how is it viewed in a context of mobilities scholarship? Because one way of thinking about climate change in relation to mobilities is to think of it as just another thematic for mobilities scholarship. But we might also want to consider that it's an inflection point. So the world through which mobility scholarship developed, starting 2 decades ago, related to a world of burgeoning globalisation, which was only increasingly seen to be on the move. And this early work embraced the need for an approach that could incorporate both these new constitutive and often transboundary mobilities within analysis, as well as the various neglected mobilities that immobilities that they presupposed. And although the mobilities field has been concerned about socio-environmental issues from the beginning, in the intervening 2 decades, climate change as an issue, but as an actuality, has escalated. It could be argued that it's shifted from being one topic amongst many on which research could focus to actually becoming the ground on which all social and cultural life, and thus all research, needs to find its feet. And moreover, the very extension and acceleration of mobility that was the initial interest of the mobilities turn has itself been intimately implicated in that shift in creating those actualities of climate change. And we're at a point at which this globalising way of life is being called into question, and the COVID pandemic just further added weight to that question. So I see this as one of the big questions for mobilities scholarship going forwards. Is climate change a thematic, or is it an inflection point? And then if so, what does that mean? And the second point that I've been reflecting on that has come up for me in relation to the framing of this panel, kind of 20 years on, CeMoRe 20 years on, is kind of a practical one, and it relates to some of the things that James was saying. So I haven't spent my whole academic trajectory in CeMoRe or as part of the global mobilities community. I've been connected to it for quite some time now. But actually my career has involved being part of what is now quite a large number of different interdisciplinary and cross-sector setups, projects, networks, groups, centres. And I think that the mobilities community is quite unique in several respects. First of all, that it's global, interdisciplinary and cross-sector, and it is cross-sector at the global level. And secondly, the fact that it still exists as a vibrant community, including having a sizable early career research contingent, and people at all career stages still very engaged and doing original and innovative work. So I think it's unique in both those ways, both in its form, but also its longevity. And without doubt, from my experience, interdisciplinary research environments are not all alike. They're very different to each other. And from that point of view, I've also been wondering, what is it that makes this keep going and that people wish to keep on putting into it? And my few brief thoughts on that. Well, first of all, that it was a really good idea in the first place. So the mobilities thesis and analysis and the new understanding which it has generated across all walks of life is powerful and still has potential. Secondly, by making the mobility the focus of analysis, it has also had huge methodological potential, and it's been very inspiring in that respect too. Also, that the analysis is relatable. It translates into multiple settings and sectors. And I suppose to add to James's analysis around fields, I started to think about Susan Lee Starr's concept of a boundary object. And so she just describes boundary objects or defines them as representational forms, things or theories that can be shared by different communities, with each holding its own understanding of the representation. And I certainly think that that's one way of charactering mobilities. It welcomes alternative analyses of the mobile and the immobile, and it has the space for those things to coexist alongside each other. And that has the effect of making people feel welcomed and valued in the space. So for me, I've found through my career, interdisciplinary research environments can sometimes be very sharp around the edges. They're not always warm or nurturing places. They can be undermining. And linking to the notion of boundary objects, I've always found mobilities in CeMoRe very welcoming. Now, you could say that's to do with the people. I don't want to say it's not. It has fabulous people in it, but so do many of the other settings that I've worked in. I think it's something more fundamental, and I think it's to do with the translatable idea, the coexistence of ideas, the appreciation that that coexistence is generative. So yeah, I think the boundary object does offer one way of thinking about what's going on. But also for me, as someone coming from a social sciences background, there is something very valuable to me about the fact that mobilities is led and framed by social sciences. In interdisciplinary environments not led by the social sciences, where you sometimes perhaps find yourself as the only social scientist, it's very easy for quite reductive ideas of what your discipline is to make engaging very difficult. So in my view, the key contribution or the key moment of creativity within sociology, possibly in the arts and humanities too, or I suppose the moment of creativity that I most enjoy engaging with, is the critical reframing of common sense views and posing different questions of the world, and therefore then having a new analysis and new forms of intervention in that world. And that idea of creativity often isn't understood, or it can be really hard to convey in spaces where there's a particular fixed idea of what your discipline can offer. And I suppose thinking back to mobilities, I think entering those kind of settings, not as a sociologist, but as a mobilities scholar, can really help, or has really helped those kind of conversations develop. And for them to develop in a way that is more authentic to me and what I bring to those spaces. And I think that communicating that has become even easier because of the pandemic, because that made complex mobility systems and their impacts across all walks of life really visible to everyone. So they're just some initial reflections. I think that especially in current contexts of higher education, where interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary work are taking a more central role within research, but also increasingly in the curriculum too. I think it's a really relevant question to explore. How does mobility still exist as a thriving global interdisciplinary cross-sector community? And I think that learning from that for the social sciences, arts and humanities especially, could be an equally significant aspect of CeMoRe's legacy as the kind of theoretical potential of that paradigm. Okay, and that's moving.
That, Nicola, was an amazing and moving talk, especially the bit when you talked about your students and how, you know, they'd endured the pandemic, and what came out of it was that they were very changed people. The future was very different, and they kind of, you know, they kind of really resonated with those problems, and that's brought a kind of whole idea of mobilities focusing on climate change and climate emergency, you know, and your project sounds absolutely fantastic. So there you go.